I'm joined now on the line by someone who, over the last almost quarter of a century, has quietly become one of the most influential public figures in the country.
Thank you, Mr. Campbell, for your very kind words. But I actually joined Fine Gael in 1998.
Pascal, I'm not talking about you. Pascal, I'm not talking about you.
Well, with the greatest of respect, I didn't interrupt you.
Pascal, I wasn't talking to you at all.
This is Here's How, Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast, presented by William Campbell.
Thank you for downloading episode 169 for the 21st of December 2023. Here's something about the Chinese economy. China's investment in real estate makes Ireland's property obsession seem breezy and carefree. Just before our crash, 12% of our economy was house building. Even if Chinese GDP figures are true, then their reliance on home building is double our peak. If their GDP is overstated, then it's worse. If China crashes, it will shake the world. China holds trillions in dollar and euro reserves and US sovereign debt. China is not a democracy, but its leaders are sensitive to public opinion and deeply paranoid about preventing unrest. If threatened, the Communist Party is likely to pull investment from anywhere it needs to keep their internal economy going and keep their population working, not protesting. But with ghost cities and 1/4 of the economy building more of them, something has to give. But when? Maybe now. Shanghai is China's largest stock exchange. The Shanghai Stock Exchange Composite, SSE Composite, has been in freefall for nearly a month. That crash, nearly 30% off peak, has put the values back a year or so, but shows no sign of slowing. No matter how unthinkable, China's building boom must end sometime, just as ours did. There's no reason to hope that it will be a soft landing. I suppose that I'm not the only one talking about the Chinese economy and its potential to take the rest of the world down with it if it collapses. But the thing about what I wrote there is the maybe now bit. Because I actually wrote that in July 2015. That's more than 8 years ago. I remember in about mid-2009 when the property myth in Ireland was still just barely believable, but only for the really gullible, I heard one journalist on the radio who had been preaching the soft landing gospel of the time that was becoming untenable. He referred to David McWilliams, who had been a lone voice warning of the instability of the property market, and he referred to him sarcastically as having predicted all 10 of the previous 1 property crashes. He was trying to argue that the property crash was not a real thing. Now, I think that sort of comment was totally disingenuous, but the point is not necessarily wrong. If you keep predicting something that is at least not impossible for long enough, then odds are eventually that you'll be proved right, not because you're Mystic Meg, but because most non-impossible things happen sooner or later. But I think it's unfair to characterize David McWilliams like that. At the time, he was pointing out obvious contradictions, such as the proportion of our economy dependent on building and the unsustainability of that, as well as of the impossibly high prices for accommodation. He wasn't so much Mystic Meg as Captain Logical, pointing out that predictions from others were just physically impossible. That brings us to the China problem. People have been predicting the end of their long boom for years, including me. Does that mean it can continue forever? Well, no, obviously. One of those supposed Chinese anecdotes fits in well here. I'm not so sure of its cultural appropriateness, or even if it's just pure Orientalism, but you'll see the relevance. A poor man does a favour for the emperor. The emperor says he can choose his reward. The poor man takes out a chessboard and asks the emperor for 1 grain of sand to be placed on the first square of the chessboard 2 grains of sand on the second square, and so on all the way. The emperor laughs at him and says he's a fool, he could have had anything from the riches of the palace, but he'll only get a few sacks of rice. The point is that if you continue doubling the number of grains and get to the 64th square on the chessboard, then how much rice will you have? Not a few sacks, not just a whole year's Chinese rice harvest, not just the world's harvest in a year, but actually more rice, far more rice than the total amount that has ever grown on the planet. That's the power of compound interest. But the Chinese economy wasn't doubling every year, it was growing at its height at about 15% per year. That, by the way, means it was doubling every 5 years. That is a totally unsustainable rate of growth. And basic economic gravity means it must come down sometime. But the Chinese economy has become addicted to growth. I'm not going to go into all the detail of that here, but I'll give just one example. Chinese local governments get more than half of their funding by selling land for development. And in China, local governments usually have responsibility for far larger populations than the whole of Ireland. Obviously, that funding from selling land gives them a massive incentive to keep the property boom getting boomier. They are huge and powerful organizations, and they are able to do that for a long time, but not forever. And the fact that they can keep the property boom going for longer means that the crash will be bigger and harder when it does come. That crash will have global impact when it comes, and it will come. I don't know when, but maybe now. In a moment, we'll have that interview with, I'm not quite sure who it's with, but first, I just want to say thanks to all of the patrons on Patreon. I really appreciate everyone who donates on Patreon. We don't get a huge amount of money out of it. We're not in the same league as other big podcasters, but it pays for things like web hosting, and Kevin and myself basically donate our time for free. It's also a great morale booster. When we get a new patron on Patreon, we know that there are people out there listening and appreciating the podcast. So we make a big effort to cover things that are undercovered in Irish media. You are more than welcome to listen for free. But if you think that you could do the same as the other donors and throw in the price of something to put in our Christmas stocking once or twice a month, there's details how to do that on the website and at the end of the show.
Do you agree? Do you disagree? Here's How is Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast.
I'm joined on the line now by someone who has, over the last couple of decades, quietly become one of the most influential public figures in the country. And
well, I wouldn't say, well, that is very kind of you, Mr. Campbell, but I wouldn't say that it's only recently become influential.
Uachtaráin, I'm sorry, Michael D. I'm not talking about you.
What do you mean you're not talking about me?
I'm not talking about you at all. I'm just going to have to take that. Right. I'm just going to have to take that again. I'll do another take. I'm joined now on the line by someone who, over the last almost quarter of a century, has quietly become one of the most influential public figures in the country.
Thank you, Mr. Campbell, for your very kind words. But I actually joined Fine Gael in 1998.
Pascal, I'm not talking about you. Pascal, I'm not talking about you.
Well, with the greatest of respect, I didn't interrupt you.
Pascal, I wasn't talking to you at all.
Oh, I'm very sorry. My apologies to you and your listeners.
Pascal, I'm talking about Mario Rosenstock. And I really do think, Mario, you have become
I knew you were talking about me. Thank you, William. I was wondering, all these other guys do you have all these other guys on the line?
Apparently I do. I don't know where they came from. But I'm gonna ask you hard questions, Mario, comedy notwithstanding, and I won't go into the psychology of comedy diverting from serious issues. But would you agree that you have actually become one of the most influential public figures in the country?
Do you know what? It's something and I'm not being fake. There's no fake humility here. There's something it's probably something I don't really think of in terms of how influential. And if I did think about that, I would probably think of it in terms of, have any of the characters or depictions of the characters or the sketches I've done kind of gone down in people's mind? And yes, so to that extent, I think that, like, for example, the stuff I was doing about Bertie Ahern in the early 2000s and the stuff I've done of Roy Keane and Michael D. Higgins and Miriam O'Callaghan and Jose Mourinho and people like that, I think that they've kind of gone into the zeitgeist, I suppose. I myself, I wouldn't call particularly influential at all, but I think that some of the kind of popular, colourful characters that I've parodied have kind of gone into the public arena. I mean, for example, a lot of people over the years have come up to me on the street and said, my only knowledge of politics is through Gift Grub.
Yeah, let me tell you, Mario, let me tell you that from off the record talking to politicians, I can absolutely say that very many of them are far more concerned with how they are portrayed by you, and indeed just whether they are portrayed by you, than they are about getting the approval of the editorial board of the Irish Times or anything like that. And I'm just wondering, how did you get the gig? Like, I didn't see a slot for a BA in radio comedy on my CAO form. How did you get into it?
Well, it's a very interesting story because it tells the story of something that was changing in modern Ireland as well with regards to media, and even with regards to the death of Dermot Morgan, would you believe? I'm
going to interrupt for younger listeners. Dermot Morgan, for less than 3 years, was the star of a show on RTE called Scrap Saturday. It ended more than 30 years ago, and its influence is still felt in Irish public life. But sorry, I interrupted. Go on.
That's right. Yes, Scrap Saturday was a Saturday radio satire, which used to poke fun and pillory and satirise social, political figures of the day. Anybody from Bono to Charles Haughey to PJ Mara, to Albert Reynolds, etc. And basically because the radio landscape and the media landscape was so small in those days, it had a captive audience. It had a captive audience, and everybody was listening. And not only was everybody listening, but everybody was enjoying the particular genius of Gerard Stembridge and Pauline McLean and Owen Rowe and Dermot Morgan himself. And people like me who were 19, 20, 21 years of age and in university at the time and always listening and looking out for things that might be slightly subversive were captivated by this kind of program that could poke fun at the establishment. And that was that, and that was 1991. Now, in 1997... a competitive radio station for RTE was suddenly started up by the creator of Riverdance, John McColgan.
Yeah.
And he decided to call that radio station Radio Ireland. And I, who was an actor at the time, was immediately captivated by this idea, the idea that a radio station would be called Radio Ireland, that it would be set itself up as a kind of a competitor to RTE radio in a way that maybe Century Radio before it had failed to do. And I sent in like a tape, but it wasn't a tape of me doing voices, funnily enough. It was a tape of me doing interviews. But anyway, to cut the long story short, I later gave up on that idea. And about a year later, I was sharing a flat with two New Zealand girls, one of whom was a kind of a TV presenter in New Zealand. And she was kind of a bit of a Charlie Bird figure in New Zealand. She used to do the political reports on the telly. And she was touring the world for a year, and I was sharing the flat with her. She used to hear me. She got a job on this nascent radio station called Radio Ireland, which was transforming into Today FM. She used to hear me doing my voices going around the flat. I used to entertain the girls in the evening, making, when they'd be making dinner, or I might make dinner, and I'd be doing voices, and I would be entertaining them. And eventually she said, "Listen, would you ever try ringing into the breakfast show that I'm working on and doing one of your voices?" And I said, "Well, like what?" I mean, I don't know. There's a big Britney Spears song was "Oops, I Did It Again," and I rang in as Jerry Adams complaining about this song and saying that it was unduly political and that it was casting aspersions on the peace process and stuff like this. And apparently I didn't think anything about it. She said they got loads of phone calls going, "We loved that Jerry Adams," and they said, "Do you do any more of this stuff?" And I'd never thought about it before, but I realised that all through my life as an actor, I'd probably done about 100 different impressions of people. Anybody from Michael Douglas to Mel Gibson to Al Pacino to Bertie Ahern I'd started doing with my friends, Jerry Adams, Martin McGuinness.
Would you call them impressions or parodies?
Parodies, stroke impressions.
Yeah. Nobody could really mistake it for the real person.
It
is a comedy. Really?
Oh, yeah. Oh, no, sorry. I mean, when I was doing them in the bar or a pub or with friends of mine, they know I was doing Bertie Ahern.
Yeah.
And I was quite good at doing Bertie. And I remember...
But my point being that if we heard Bertie Ahern as your character on Today FM, nobody would mistake that for the actual interviewer, the actual voice of Bertie Ahern, that you were doing a comedy, a comedic interpretation of that.
Oh, yes, absolutely. It was always sketches. So they said, do you do more of this stuff? And I'd never counted the number of characters I did. Mm-hmm. And actually, I did about 100 characters. And I'd been doing them since I was 5 or 6 years of age, including my parents and aunties and members of my family. And I used to put on little skits. But I'd never really kind of regarded it as a career. I was an actor in my mind. But anyway, in the funny, the juxtaposition of all this is funny because the actual first day of Radio Ireland was March 17th, 1997. And on March 17th, 1997, who launched the station but Dermot Morgan? Mm-hmm. And he did it with a comedy performance in Andrews Lane Theatre with Pauline McLean and the Scrap Saturday guys. Yep. So it kind of marked... And then, of course, a year later, Dermot Morgan very, very, very tragically died. Mm-hmm. And basically then, I got into the car, taxi, and I did a load of voices. And they went, can you write? And I went, no, I've never tried writing. And they went, will you try? And I went, I'll try it. And the first little bits I did were very juvenile and sort of undergraduate. But I got used to it. And basically, I learned that writing is practice. Yeah. Writing is hours and hours and hours and years and months and weeks of churning out scripts and getting better at what you write and finding ways to deliver your joke, deliver your punchlines, deliver an angle, surprise people, cloak things, mask things, make them obvious at times and not obvious at others.
One question about that, because I would talk to a lot of journalists on this podcast, and you're perhaps, I don't think so, but some people might think this is a lighter version of the podcast, but we hear a lot about journalistic ethics. Do you have a responsibility to be politically balanced or to, present characters in a balanced way?
No, I have no responsibility to do that. Uh-huh. However, I have my own personal standards.
Yeah.
And I believe, and I think this is germane to what's happening nowadays. So, for example, you have a lot of comedians out there at the moment who are quite clearly Sinn Féin supporters.
Yeah.
And I worry for some of those comedians because I wonder that when Sinn Féin assumes power, as it surely will, and Sinn Féin does not deliver, as it surely will not, how will those comedians satirise that government?
Yeah.
They will be finished. Comedians, because they won't be able to satirise the government. So
they may or may not rise to the occasion.
It'll be very difficult to rise to the occasion for them because they are outed as such as being Sinn Féin supporters. Yeah. Whereas myself, I am not an outed supporter of any political party. And as a satirist, I believe everybody must be held to account in positions of power. That doesn't mean necessarily that, let's say, a government. Imagine a government is actually doing, let's say, a good job. Should a satirist then write loads of sketches just calling them shit the whole time?
Yeah.
Perhaps not. So just because somebody's in power doesn't mean you satirise them. I think you satirise people who are in power who are doing things badly and you hold them to account. Mm-hmm. And that's the voice.
Or potentially in opposition.
Or in opposition, as very much so.
And you mentioned the history of this, and you and I might be getting a little bit older than some of the audience, so it's just worth remembering that clearly you're on Today FM. That frequency, that licence had previously been held, as you said, by Century Radio, and it had lain dormant for a few years. Century Radio, which is not connected with Today FM other than holding, being the successor on that licence. Oliver Barry basically got that licence by bribing Ray Burke, and that was exposed in the tribunals. That Century Radio failed commercially. Obviously, being good at bribing politicians doesn't necessarily make you good at running a radio station. But Today FM eventually has become a huge success, hugely commercially successful, and you're a huge part of that. Does that give you leverage to have artistic freedom?
And no, sometimes it restricts your artistic freedom in a way, because having a large amount of commercial success means the owners of the commercial success are then in a situation where they are protecting large amounts of commercial success. And they don't they are worried about you perhaps jeopardizing that commercial success by pinning certain vested interests off. However, the fact of the matter is...
Go on, spill the dirt.
Well, however, the fact of the matter is that because of the trust that they've given me over the last 25 years as an editor or as a co-editor of my work, because I regard myself as a co-editor with Ian Dempsey and my team, as sort of people who they would say, listen, I don't know, that might just be a bit off, that mightn't work, Mario, and I would take their advice very much. So as a co-editor of that work, the powers that be in Today FM have given me their trust. And that's something that's very, very hard to come by. So, for example, I'll give you an example, William. If I was to suggest Gift Grub on national radio now, it would not be given a job.
I agree completely.
Because people would just go, what? No way. We're not having that. And if somebody said to them, no, you don't know this guy. He's really funny. Look, I don't care how funny he is. What the like far-right riots in Dublin, feckin' Israel, Hamas, this thing could destroy us.
Yeah.
So, I guess you have to walk a line whereby people understand that you have a free rein in what you do, but at the same time, you are going to be sensible and judicious, maybe not to destroy the whole thing and blow the whole thing up.
Yeah, and I mean, you haven't been afraid to have a go at, sports personalities, famously Roy Keane, Katie Taylor, people in like pop music like Keith Duffy, businessmen like famously again Michael O'Leary. Have you ever had a pop at Dennis O'Brien?
Not when he owned us, particularly. And I actually inadvertently had a pop at Dennis O'Brien, and it's funny because I kind of got almost sort of set. The censorship, I told you, there's no censorship, really. They kind of put their trust in you. But when Communicore owned us, and Dennis, therefore, owned us, I did a sketch where I thought it was one of the funniest sketches, and you can look at it up on the YouTube if you want to. So, it was post-crash, and I did a sketch about Brian Cowan. And the idea was that the sketch... an idea can come from one sentence you read in the newspaper. So I had heard that Brian Cowan, post-crash, post this debacle that had happened, had suddenly been made put on the board of Topaz.
Mm-hmm. Which is a Dennis O'Brien, at least partly owned company, oil company.
Correct. So I had then said to the guys inside, let's do a sketch on Brian Cowan. And the guys went, well, what's the sketch? And I went, what about Brian Cowan starts working in Topaz in Clara in County Offaly, right? With his cap on and everything, and he's working behind the glass. But
in the actual filling station.
In the actual filling station. Unfortunately, he starts running the filling station into the ground after a couple of weeks. And he starts offering all these crazy offers like you can, with every Bailey briquettes, you can get 2 7-Ups and all these mad sort of offers, which won't work. And eventually the sketch ends up with the filling station blowing up outside and a tanker exploding. And Cowan behind the glass going, well, obviously going forward, that was a bit of a disaster. Right? Anyway, the sketch went out. And
we are where we are, yeah.
Hoots of laughter, except from, I didn't realise, and we didn't realise that it would be taken so seriously by Dennis but not even by Dennis, but by Dennis's proxy people who said, you have to get that sketch offline. Get it offline, please, because we have people coming into the Topaz stores, ripping up their loyalty cards, going, F Brian Cowan. I didn't know he was on the thing. So the sketch had already gone out, and the guys politely asked me, listen, Mario, for the sake of peace, would you mind if we took it out from the online thing? And I went, I was a bit prickly at the beginning going, censorship! Mm-hmm. But I went, no, the sketch has already gone out. The sketch is on YouTube. Do they want me to take it down from the Today FM online? So that was okay. I decided. I said, listen, go on, fine. So in other words, I cooperated as a team player, if you like.
Yeah.
But that was, I suppose, an instance whereby I had overstepped the corporate line. But yeah. I don't know. But subsequently, and this will tell you a story as well, William, about the way things actually work. About a year later, I was invited to a dinner with Dennis, myself and Ian, and people like that, about 10 people around the table. I was invited to dinner. And somebody said, tell Dennis the story of the Topaz sketch.
Mm-hmm.
So I told exactly the story of the Topaz sketch in more detail than I told you. And Dennis nearly fell off his chair laughing, and he went, where can I get the sketch? You have to send it to me. And I went, well, it's been taken down, Dennis, because your people took it down. And he went, what did they take it down for? It sounds hilarious. See what I mean?
I do, although I think it is reasonable to observe that Dennis O'Brien has been famously thin-skinned, and your more journalistic colleague Sam Smith, who was famous for investigating various corruptions in conjunction with the tribunals, he was sacked, and there is no question that order came directly from Dennis O'Brien, not from his people. He was sacked pretty much the instant that it was politically possible for Dennis O'Brien to do that.
And Waterford Whispers were cautioned, were put on notice as well.
I can tell you, I've been put on notice, not by Dennis O'Brien, but by people with an awful lot of money whose name you might recognise, and the bark is an awful lot worse than the bite in that case, although I don't, that perhaps is not a problem until it is, but we shall see whether this or any other podcast survives. But I mean, the core point of that is that there is no denying that ownership and finance is very powerful within the media. And I have talked to journalists both on the podcast and, on background stuff and unattributable stuff. And there are some journalists who I have huge respect for, who are unquestionably sophisticated and thinking people, who will then try to say, well, actually, this instance where someone has enormous financial leverage over me doesn't colour my coverage at all. I think that's just never credible. Would you agree with that?
I would, because it is not credible, because the fact of the matter is that the market means that the ownership of this by a titan, let's say, means you will self-censor.
Yeah.
So you might not be censored, but it's the self-censorship that is really the issue. We are then duty bound to be careful whenever we approach the idea of anything that would interfere with our owner's interests.
Yeah.
So yes, the bottom line was, whenever I was doing a sketch, we would go, not that it would arise that much, because it didn't often intersect. But if it ever did intersect, we'd go, hang on, Dennis, Dennis owns that or something.
I note the first name terms. I note your own first name terms.
We'd be calling him Dennis in a meeting.
Yeah.
So, so we wouldn't be saying Dennis O'Brien owns that, because we'd be calling our owner Dennis, or whatever. Just as we would call, even we've never met our owner now, Yvonne Bauer in Germany, but we would probably say, oh, Yvonne wouldn't like that.
Understood.
What I mean?
Yeah.
None of us have ever met Yvonne. But to answer your question, William, you would be a fool to think that you don't have some element of being self-censoring. That's the nature of a human being.
Yeah, if you listen to particularly American news broadcasts, or you pick them up on YouTube or whatever, you will often hear kind of an under-the-breath almost acknowledgement, and they'll talk about this story or that, and they'll say, oh, by the way, this company is owned by this conglomerate, which also owns this network. And they will always verbally mark out that potential conflict of interest, or at least that interest that they may be perceived to have in a story, so they can then say, well, whenever we did a report on that, we pointed out to the listeners that there is cross-ownership between that TV network and whoever they were covering.
As Matt Cooper had to do on The Last Word. So Matt Cooper would go, so let's go now to the courts and talk about Dennis O'Brien. I should add that Dennis O'Brien is the owner of this radio station, and thus I'm a la 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 la.
Yeah,
so he would always do that as well.
Okay. Does comedy need that sort of a health warning?
Doesn't need it.
Should it have it?
No, it shouldn't have it. And it doesn't need it. But it is a fact of life in a commercial radio station owned by a powerful person.
Yeah.
That interests intersect, and that one would be within reason. Within reason, one's job would become untenable if, like, let's say your owner of the radio station became Taoiseach.
Yeah.
Well, then you couldn't be doing sketches on the Taoiseach. Well, then my job would be untenable.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%.
Then I would have to give up, because I would have to give up my job, because I wouldn't be able to do my job at all.
Yeah.
Now, I would have to then judge, does the owner of my radio station preclude me from doing my job? In the main, no. What percentage would you say? 98% no. Is there a 2% whereby you would be self-censoring according to watching their interests? Yes, there is. Is 98% enough? Yes, it is, on the balance of reason.
Yeah, so I agree with you 100%. I think you're entirely correct, and I think there is always ownership. Somebody is always paying your salary, and inevitably that person is somebody who has the power to pay your salary or the power to not pay your salary, and it's just absolutely naive to imagine otherwise. But what I take issue with is people who say, oh no, it doesn't matter who pays my salary. I am a Vestal virgin who is utterly uninfluenced by that. And
best to admit it. To admit it.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And then if you have a plurality of media ownership and plurality of media ownership models, be it private sector, semi-state, public sector and so forth, then across that media spread you get a variety of voices and points of view, and I think that's what serves the public and public interest best. And in fact, I note you're easily the most prominent broadcaster who has never seriously been employed by RTE, and that's quite notable. And I hadn't really thought that before. I was, it hadn't struck me before I had researching this.
There's a reason for that.
Yeah, go on.
But there's a reason for that. I mean, obviously, I used to work in Glenroe as an actor. I was on contract. I've done 3 television series for RTE, for which I was on contract. But I've never been an employee of RTE, and I've never worked for RTE. And I would find that a bit of an issue, to be honest.
Yeah.
Because it is hard to be a semi-state satirist.
Yeah. Yes. Exactly. Yeah. That's
I mean, really, there will be there will really be an unconscious bias of some self-censoring there, of things that you places you won't go. I mean, for example, with regard to the present RTE troubles.
Yeah.
I mean, particularly during the Public Accounts Committee hearings, and what needs to be said and what needs to be unsaid or not said. I mean, that is a difficult position for anybody to be. And if you're employed biting the hand that feeds you and you're watching these Public Accounts Committee, I'm sure it would be a difficult position to be in.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Some journalists in RTE have, I think, performed very well, that limitation notwithstanding, but that's not an argument that limitation does not exist. And I think it's maybe instructive for people to understand, and you mentioned Scrap Saturday, and that both you and Oliver Cowan are clearly in that heritage, and it is very striking that you and I are 30 years after it finished its very short life are still talking about it, and many other people still talk about it. It was unquestionably savage, and you call it parody, and I think that is understating what Scrap Saturday was. It was absolutely savage about some politicians, to the point which one of the sons of Charlie Haughey physically threatened Dermot Morgan, and Dermot Morgan responded using wit, which turned out to be an awful lot more powerful. But Scrap Saturday was off the air within weeks of Century Radio collapsing, going bust and going off the air. And I know people involved, I spoke to people who were peripherally involved in Scrap Saturday, and they were absolutely convinced that was no coincidence. Because,
what do you explain that, William?
Well, I have this from sources that I cannot quote, but I have absolutely very close to the story itself. Essentially, Century Radio, which I must emphasise is not commercially connected to your station, was failing. They needed listenership and they weren't getting it, and they were offering huge money to Scrap Saturday, because actually I disagree with you. It wasn't just some people. Everybody in the country was listening to Scrap Saturday. They were offering huge amounts of money to Scrap Saturday to move to Century Radio, and far more than they were being paid, and they were being paid an absolute pittance by RTE. Dermot Morgan and I think Jerry Stembridge in particular were using that as leverage to not get cancelled from RTE, because of course if they were cancelled they could just walk across the city to, or perhaps take the bus to the Century Radio studios and set up there. Once Century Radio went bust, Scrap Saturday had nowhere to go, and it was off RTE within weeks. Probably the most successful radio programme RTE had ever had, they cancelled.
Wow.
And there was a fig leaf to them cancelling it in terms of a dispute over the level of payment, but the level of payment was absolutely a pittance.
Why did RTE say they cancelled it?
I can't speak for RTE, but as I recall, the line put out at the time was the negotiations over a new series were unsuccessful. And
but is that possible?
It may have been. I would say that is something that was true but irrelevant. There was no way in hell that Scrap Saturday was good. I mean, to be fair, RTE were coming under enormous political pressure to get it off the air. And Charles Haughey was, I think, still in power at that time, and they were taking huge heat, and they were caught between a rock and a hard place, because this was a very popular programme, and they didn't.
Can I get in there and just have just discuss it with you for a second, because.
I will allow you to ask a question. Go ahead.
Absolutely, yeah. So will we take it as read, and especially because I think you've done a bit of research on this, so will we take it as read then that in your opinion, and in fact more than opinion, in your understanding, Scrap Saturday was deliberately cancelled because of pressures from the outside?
There was a fig leaf, but as I think it was Henry Ford said, for every decision there is a good reason and a real reason. And I think basically the Scrap Saturday team were offered just an unfeasibly small amount of money they literally couldn't eat. Never mind pay a team of people with it. So that was the fig leaf. So it wasn't that was perhaps an excuse that was acceptable, was able then to be put down on paper. And we should, of course, remember that there was satellite TV somewhat at the time, but there was really no internet, and the outlet for unapproved opinions was vastly narrower. We should remember at the time, Dermot Morgan moved on then to making Father Ted, at a time at which RTE's comedy output was Leave It to Mrs. O'Brien, and that kind of really tells you how safe RTE had to play then and perhaps now. And I'm really wondering, do you feel you have the position as the fool at Lear's court who is able to say the unsayable because you say it in a comedy way? Or do you say, which I know Ian Dempsey has said, and there's nothing wrong with that, but it's just to give people a bit of a laugh in the morning?
Mm-hmm. Well, obviously giving people a laugh in the morning is very, very important. A lot can be, as I said to you earlier on, about masked and put under the cloak of giving people a laugh, and you can make a lot of editorial, if you like, imputations and attitudes about things going forward. I mean, to wit, I feel I was unfairly, in some cases, castigated by some people for making Bertie Ahern overly lovable. At a time when Bertie Ahern was clearly very, very highly regarded and liked by a lot of people in the country. In other words, what I was doing in many respects was reflecting the way kind of Bertie saw himself, Bertie projected himself, and the way a lot of the population felt about him.
Pause with that idea, because Bertie Ahern almost uniquely, and the only possible exception I can think of is actually Boris Johnson. And I've talked to people off the record and just casually in Fianna Fáil who met him and who are familiar with him. Bertie Ahern, certainly uniquely in Irish politics, had a public persona that was utterly at variance with his private personality. And is there a degree to, and this whole thing, and people who, particularly in Drumcondra and the north side of Dublin, who are maybe even peripherally involved in politics and have come across him, will be aware that this whole stuttering thing and the malapropisms is entirely affected in order to mask an absolutely ruthless political operator. Is there a degree to which you conspired in that almost fooling the public?
I think that nearly every time I did Bertie in a sketch of any sort of...
you have got heat for this before, I should note.
Oh, you have, yeah. But I think some of it is misread. In nearly all my sketches, I did Bertie as the guy who understood that he was perceived as that, played the fool up himself to be that for the people, and then when the mics were off, in inverted commas, you saw he had everything under control. That he was in control of Noonan and the opposition, that he was toying with them. He was, in a sense, Roger the Dodger. He was, in a sense, the most ruthless, cunning and devious of them all, and that he was putting on this act. So I did this as an act. I mean, the actual act of making Gift being a north side sort of inner city
good,
kind of,
means
that's
basically.
Good,
yeah.
And grub being food. The idea was that Bertie had asked to be next door to the most popular breakfast DJ in the country, Ian Dempsey, in which Bertie would not be asked any political questions, no way, but he would be pictured every day cooking a fry beside another famous person, maybe Ronan Keating. It was a political ploy, so what it was a parody of the political ploy of Bertie Ahern. Very same time, Tony Blair was over in Downing Street having coffee with the Gallagher brothers. This is what they did. They were populist. They were the first populists. They were the men of the people. This is Bertie's man of the people. Blair was a man of the people. So there was this idea that, like, I'm not one of these aloof, austere politicians, Macmillan and Wilson and all these, Anthony and sort of, these guys from the past, Margaret Thatcher. I'm now of you. I'm young. I played guitar in a band. Bertie was there. I loved the Bee Gees. I like, the Bee Gees and all this sort of stuff. So I was reflecting the fact that he was playing this game. However, my Bertie was cunning, because he always got the better of Noonan. So a bit like the Wile Coyote.
You mean Michael, because just so people know, Michael Noonan, who was at the time leader of Fine Gael, briefly.
I'm talking about Michael Noonan. I'm talking about that guy. I'm talking about the guy who had a very quiet voice. And when he had billons and billons and billons, his voice was very high. And when he only had a couple of million, his voice dropped down to very low indeed.
So like Bertie had this guy kind of on a string. And that's the Bertie I played. Now, I think that's kind of, let me see, how would I extrapolate from that? That's kind of funny, and it's kind of charming. The idea of the rapscallion who gets away with stuff. The idea of the guy who, he's playing a game with you, but you kind of like his game. And anyway, the economy's going great, and we're all wearing high vis, and everybody's stuffing their face full of breakfast rolls. Why wouldn't you be? Sure, he's a bit of a laugh. And he likes Man U, and he likes the Dubs, and he likes the Bee Gees, and he goes to Neil Diamond concerts. And he builds roads all over the country. What's not to love? Now, people would come and say, you're not going on about the money he stole. Mm-hmm. To be honest with this, right? I really, 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 obviously I've thought about this more than vast majority of people over the years. And I have to say, I want you to give me the address of the castle Bertie Ahern owns in Switzerland. And I want you to tell me the dacha that he owns in Russia. And I want you to tell me the 4,000 acres he owns in Canada. And I want you to tell me how many sort of women he went off with. And I want you to tell me the diamonds that are under his floorboards. It's clear to me that the Bertie Ahern that wasn't particularly interested in in enriching himself. Right?
He arranged to buy a house in a false name and have somebody falsely declare that they owned a house that in reality he was the beneficial owner of.
I do understand
in order to hide and he lied about not having bank accounts, both in order to hide those assets from his ex-wife.
Correct, but it is a long, long, long way.
Mm-hmm.
From
yes, you're correct. Yes, the level of Putin-esque or whatever corruption, you're absolutely correct on that.
And even at any level,
yeah.
I mean, you're talking about a guy who's like living in a basic house.
Yeah.
Now,
and that is something we can perhaps be proud of in Ireland, that our corruption often, not always, often, we get mad about stuff that some people in other countries is almost pedestrian. And I take your point, and you are correct to point that out. But for example, and you've done them already, Paschal Donohoe, you actually are very good at showing the duality between a personality that he perhaps has, for the cameras, for the voters, and one that he has that might be inward political facing. Yeah. And I think that's a very good thing to do. And I think that punctures that particular balloon, and it tells a truth that is very difficult to get out otherwise in a serious setting. And actually the whole shtick, the punchline of that is the flip in Paschal Donohoe from the public-facing personality.
I call him Ballymun Paschal. So it's this idea that Paschal Donohoe is the nicest boy on the street. He's the best boy in the class.
The dimples.
He's Mr. Polite. He will ask you. He will answer you questions more thoroughly than anybody's ever answered a question. But behind this calm persona and mild-mannered character is a ruthless and quite tough and streetwise political operator. And there's no question, and I've often seen Leo as kind of, and the way I play it on Gift is that Leo's kind of the front guy, the kind of the PR guy, push him out there. And of course, like a lot of PR guys who you push out there, they end up putting their foot in their mouth. To wit, Boris Johnson. I mean, they're talking. No, I mean, they just talk nonsense.
That might be suitable nonsense, though.
Well, maybe to their ends, but it's. They also
but absolutely nonsense.
They also make tragically bad mistakes, which they end up hoisted on their own petard for. And behind this is a man pulling strings, and I see it as a kind of a Paschal Donohoe character, who's actually running the whole show. I've always felt that for me that he's bigger figure in Fine Gael, let's say, than we're let on to be known.
I would tend to agree. He is not of the stature that Bertie Ahern was in Fianna Fáil, but I would tend to agree on that. On Pascal, it'll be interesting to see who succeeds.
Leo Varadkar. Get a word about. I just want to finish about Bertie there. I haven't finished about Bertie.
Go ahead.
And that is that, like, there's no question that he was guilty of impropriety.
Yeah.
There's no question not only of that he lied about these improprieties. All I was trying to do was trying to put it in a context of real unbridled corruption, which was self-serving and aggrandizing and enriching yourself to a most disgusting degree.
Yeah, I think that's correct, and that's a fair observation of Ahern, and also observing about the peace process.
Yeah, but there's another thing there as well. I mean, there was another thing as well, and that is that the Haughey thing, right? And it was about Scrap Saturday, and I don't think we could talk about Scrap Saturday all day. And I mean, obviously, I've listened to Scrap Saturday, and I think I'm not so sure about your full analysis of it, and that is that, like, obviously, I've listened to Scrap Saturday, right? And obviously, how do I feel about this character, Charles J. Haughey, and Scrap Saturday? I like him. Why? Because he's getting away with it, and he's brilliant. He is brilliant. He's funny.
But Scrap Saturday has to be seen in the context of the rest of the media and how more controlled it was in the absence of the internet. So, for example, Pauline McGinn played a character who was never named in the entire thing, was never named, which is something that, and I don't want to give away your secrets, but you kind of say the name of the person that you were parodying quite early in the sketch so that people are able to clue into that. Of Terry Keane, who was Charles Haughey's mistress. She reproduced Terry Keane's voice to a T, listened to tapes of her and so forth, and they could smuggle into the public domain information that was 100% unavailable except to a very small, media political elite. So in the context of what was the information landscape, I do think Scrap Saturday was revolutionary. And,
oh yes, absolutely.
And the proof in the pudding is that it was attacked both by politicians behind the scenes and ultimately and very quickly knocked off the air.
Hang on though, William. There are again. This is double-edged. There's a duality to this as well. There is not one politician in Dáil Éireann who did not want to be on Scrap Saturday.
That may well be true, and that might be a measure of their own vanity. But I would have said that Charlie Haughey pretty much did not want to be on Scrap Saturday, and for sure his politically aspiring children did not want to be on Scrap Saturday, and with absolute certainty Terry Keane did not want to be on Scrap Saturday.
That's true. But I think that they were living in an era whereby a statesman like Charles Haughey, it would have been, to be cartooned vocally on the radio, it would have been deemed as a gross insult. However, the actual depiction of Haughey itself was a depiction of a winner, a man who was completely in command of his own destiny, a man who was toying with his peers, his colleagues, and a man who, if I was Charles Haughey, I would have gone, I fucking love the sound of myself on Scrap Saturday. In other words, the depiction of Charles Haughey was of almost a lovable rogue.
Yeah, I think you're correct, but I think that the existence of vanity does not disprove the existence of corruption. And the point, and I want to avoid the two of us going too much into radio nostalgia from the 1990s, but the point that I'm kind of getting at there is that, and I think actually, and I know that you've worked to some degree with Oliver Cowan, and he does, I think, a very good job on RTE, but I think overall it absolutely has to be said that RTE and Irish broadcasting in general, of which RTE is a very large subset, has a problem with comedy. Oliver Cowan does, I think he uses the Hugh Edwards character, which is kind of ironic, and the Brian Dobson character to have like very, very sharp observations that are really just pretty sharp observations that would not get broadcast otherwise, almost dressed up as comedy. The comedy, I think, in those particular characters is secondary. But I think what is happening in Ireland is that there are absolutely some things that are still being unsaid. And one that strikes me, because you mentioned it, is the RTE scandal, the corruption scandal in RTE, of which has various aspects to it, Ryan Tubridy being only one small part. But one part that has not been mentioned almost at all on RTE, that has not been mentioned to my hearing either by yourself or Oliver Cowan or anyone else who is, perhaps a secondary deliverer of news about the world, is the involvement of Renault, an enormous multinational motor company, which was up to its neck in the corruption of both RTE corporately and individual broadcasters there. I have done it, I know. There is, if you do a search of RTE articles about that mentioning Renault, it is almost non-existent. Yeah. And I don't think that can be separated from the fact that Renault in particular, and the motor industry in general, the wider motor industry, if you include insurance and oil and so forth, is an enormous advertiser. And they can't, or perhaps they feel, they cannot challenge that. And it's just extraordinary that we have essentially foreign companies who have an interest, particularly in the topic of climate change, not being covered extensively or deeply on our national broadcaster. And they have essentially, by giving away the odd free car and allowing their accounting system to be used to essentially launder under-the-counter payments that were not politically or publicly very acceptable, that has been a very, very cheap way to buy a gigantic amount of influence in Irish broadcasting and perhaps also print media. And I'm here banging away, but I am, and maybe it's not your responsibility, maybe it's not Oliver Callan's responsibility, but that is something that I think deserves intense scrutiny and is getting exactly zero.
It seems to me to be the situation that exists and prevails around the world. I mean, you mentioned the climate change there, and yes, there is a conflict of interest, unless you're, I suppose, even exclusively an electric car maker. But yes, there is a conflict of interest. To say that there's a conflict of interest is it speaks for itself, though, William. I mean, pretty much everything that occurs potentially in our world can be looked at as a conflict of interest.
But stories, even stories that were deeply damaging to RTE were let onto RTE. There was an element of people being let off the leash to a specific degree, but they kind of knew they had to do it, literally to the extent that they decapitated, their own DG quite correctly. There's no, and that was done, but they couldn't touch the advertiser who was clearly up to their neck in that corruption scandal, and it's literally unmentioned.
I mean, I don't know where
Am I stumping you? Yes, that is correct. That is a good point. Yeah. And perhaps you don't. And I might be asking you that question unfairly.
I do get that there's potential satire and comedy in the crossover between very big brands and media organizations. Beyond that, though, I see what's happened. I mean, obviously they're keen to protect their future stream of revenue, and so maybe they eased off and didn't go in as hard as they could have.
Yeah,
but I think people can see that a mile off, William. You're not like you wouldn't.
Well, the public discussion was very much around the barbecuing of RTE executives at the Public Accounts Committee. And first of all, I shouldn't be demanding you answer for that as a crime, because that's not exclusively your responsibility. But in other countries, well, to look at our nearest neighbour in BBC, you have essentially a broadcasting organisation entirely free of commercial influence, and in ITV and particularly the other channels, some of them, you have broadcasting systems that are entirely free of financial control, at least from the government. And if you synthesise all of that, you can get quite a good crossover, and we don't have that in Ireland.
It's one of the issues of the day, and I mean, for example, they don't really have. They don't really have a main public service broadcasting really in America at all. PBS, but like
the internet. That market is large enough that almost any segment of the audience can be covered. It might not be on broadcast TV, but on by internet coverage.
This is, the argument you're espousing there is dead on, because what it really argues for is the separation of RTE into two distinct pieces: a commercial and a public service arm. So that if something is said on the commercial arm, whatever. But if something is said on the public arm, there's no fear of favour and no worry about what's being said. But you're dead right. It's a self-censorship issue again, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yes, and I actually believe that it's not somebody there saying, although that has happened a non-zero number of times, somebody's storming in the door and saying, that's, they're an advertiser, don't say a word about them. But that is a very, very small portion of the problem. The real problem is the censor that sits imaginarily on the journalist or perhaps satirist's shoulder saying, yeah, that's the guy who pays my salary, I better better kind of ease off a little bit there, and then telling themselves that they're only being fair and believing themselves that they are not being influenced. That is where I see the problem. But again, there's an element here of you interviewing me.
No, I agree. No, I totally agree that there is a problem there, William. And the only thing I would say about that is, unless you are working alone in a cave and yet managing to broadcast to billions of people without anybody paying your wages, then there's always some conflict of interest.
Yeah, I agree. To round up, Mario, this has been a huge chunk of your life. A, did you ever expect that? And B, how long are you going to continue? Are you going to kind of get your pension out of this?
I thought that I would only last 3 months. I thought that it would only last 3 months because I was exhausted after about a month of it, physically trying to do a sketch. Whenever I put all my effort into doing a sketch and I thought it was a little bit of in my own humble opinion, I thought, Jesus, this morning's one was a bit of a masterpiece, in my own opinion. They just turn around to me and go, so what's tomorrow? And I'd nearly burst out crying, going, sorry, I have to do it again tomorrow. I have to come up with think of something tomorrow. Yeah, we'll help you. And people, Ian Dempsey, of course, he's a great mind and all this sort of stuff, and the producers and everybody. But it would be on you to come up with something tomorrow. And it was only after about a year or two of doing it that I changed my attitude to doing it. And that was that I am absolutely doing this almost as a vocation. That I'm doing it all the time. I'm doing it 24 hours a day. Yeah. I'm doing it every time I speak. I'm doing it every time I think. I'm doing it every time I look out the mirror.
I should say that when we were setting this up, I kind of wanted to clear with you whether you were willing to even do the voices, because
no problem at all.
But I can understand that might be something you might be sensitive about.
I do it all the time, and I write ideas down all the time for sketches, and I always have 15, 20 ideas on the go for sketches because that's my life now. Before I wasn't admitting it's my life. I was going, this is a job, and a job is different to a life. And I found this job overwhelmingly difficult, but not when it became my life. When it became my life, I find it easy. And so I'm just a creature who does this all the time. And I'm energized by it. And I sleep every night going, I know I have ideas for tomorrow. And I'm gifted with a great amount of energy, personal, physical energy. And I'm so grateful for whatever spirit that is up there that allows me to do this. Because I do believe I bring some mirth into people's lives, and yes, I will keep doing it forever, and I'm going to keep doing it in all media. Radio is one of my favorites, but I perform on stage all the time. I do TV series, and I do stuff on the internet and podcasts and everything. So I'm going to do it in every single arm I can imagine doing it, and keep doing it until I drop, I think. So it will always be my life. I wasn't getting enough jobs as an actor. So basically I went, why don't I just write every character for myself and perform every role? So every day I give myself 8 parts.
Mario Rosenstock, fantastic talent, unique broadcaster, and as I said at the start, uniquely influential. Thank you very much for talking to me.
I'm very happy to talk to you today, William, and thank you for having me.
Go to the website for sources and references from the show. And while you're there, you can like the show on Facebook, follow the show on Twitter at Here's How Podcast, and follow Mario Rosenstock at GiftGrubMario. And get in touch if you want to suggest a guest or a topic for a future show. Thanks again to all of the patrons on Patreon. It covers the cost of keeping the podcast going. And if you could throw in the cost of putting something in our Christmas stocking, or even just the cost of a new pair of socks, that'd be really great. Please go and sign up at patreon.com/here's how. That link is on the website. Also there you can find out how to subscribe to the podcast for free on your computer, on your phone, or by email. All that information is at www.here'show.ie. The Here's How podcast is produced and presented by me, William Campbell. The co-producer is Kevin Wolf. So, happy Christmas, Merry New Year, and thank you for listening.